The letter arrived on a Thursday in March of 1887, and Nora Vane read it standing in the county land office, with her coat still buttoned and her gloves still on, because she had not expected to stay long enough to take them off. She had come in the ordinary way of a woman whose husband had died leaving debts and a disputed claim, expecting the committee to name a figure and a date and send her back out into the cold with one problem exchanged for another. The land office smelled of tobacco and wet wool, and the particular kind of official indifference that settles into a room where difficult things are decided, and no one in the room is required to bear the difficulty afterward. There were 4 men at the long table and a clerk at the side desk, and Nora standing at the front of it, the way a person stands when they have not been offered a chair. What she had not expected was what Holt Drucker, seated at the head of the long table with his fingers laced in front of him, said when the clerk finished reading the partition order aloud. He said it with the mild, almost pleasant efficiency of a man who had already moved on to the next item of business. He said the parcel they were assigning the widow Vane was the 40-acre lowland tract along the South Fork, the one they had been calling the Blackwater piece since before Nora was born, and that the committee had been more than generous in the circumstances. Old Gus Farr, at the far end of the table, said that the South Fork parcel was standing water 6 months a year, and that perhaps a more tillable piece might be found. Holt thanked Gus for his concern and said the partition was settled. Nora folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She did not say anything. She did not know yet what she had been given, and she would not know for a long time. What she understood on that Thursday was that the committee had given her the parcel nobody wanted and called it generosity, and that she was expected to fail quietly, and that Holt Drucker had watched her face the whole time he was speaking, looking for the moment she understood all 3 things at once. She did not give it to him. She thanked the clerk, said good afternoon to the room, and walked out into the cold with 40 acres of standing swamp and a letter that smelled like damp paper and old wood. If you stay with this story until its end, you will see what the committee did not, which is what a person does with ground that the confident have decided has no use. She did not fail quietly. She did not fail at all. The South Fork lowland ran along the Scioto bottomland a mile and a half east of Millhaven, Ohio, in a crook of ground where the water table sat so close to the surface that in wet years you could not push a fence post 2 feet before it began to lean. It was the kind of land that appeared on county maps in an uncolored blank, the way cartographers noted places with no agricultural use and no particular interest, places that existed mainly as boundaries for more valuable ground on either side. Nora had known the parcel by sight all her life. As a girl, she had heard her father, Elias, describe the land with an exactness that made the other men at the feed store go quiet and look at their boots, not because they agreed with him, but because the specificity of his description made them uneasy in the way that a confident opinion about a subject they had dismissed can make people uneasy. Elias Vane had not been born in Ohio. He had come from a place in western Pennsylvania where his own father, a Dutch drainage man named Peter, who had come over in the 1840s, had spent a lifetime teaching him that wet ground was not ruined ground. It was only ground that had not yet been read correctly. Peter had taught Elias to walk a slope before he touched it, to find the low seams that water followed underground, to cut channels not against the water's intention but with it, guiding rather than fighting. He had used an expression, passed down to him from his own father in the Netherlands, that Elias had translated imperfectly and taught to Nora in English. You do not drain the water. You give it a better road. Elias had brought those lessons to Ohio and practiced them on a modest 40-acre piece of his own that the neighbors had thought marginal when he bought it, and which had produced steady crops for 12 years by the time his lungs began to fail, because he had spent the first 2 seasons cutting channels rather than planting, and the channels had dried the ground to the depth of a good root. He had taught those lessons to Nora in the years before. The lungs took him entirely, walking her across wet fields with his leveling rod on his shoulder and explaining in patient, unhurried sentences what the ground was telling him through the instrument, what the slight dip in a field surface concealed about the flow 30 inches below, how a channel cut half an inch too steep would scour its own walls and fill with sand in a season, and a channel cut half an inch too shallow would stagnate and breed the kind of standing water it was meant to move. He made her walk the same piece 3 mornings in a row once before he let her touch a spade to it, until she could describe from memory where every thread of underground water was traveling. "That is the reading," he said. "Everything else is just digging." When he died, in the winter of Nora's 16th year, she kept the leveling rod, a wooden pole his own father had turned, bound at the graduated marks with copper wire that had gone green with age. She kept his notebook, too, a small cloth-bound thing filled with his careful hand, elevation readings and channel calculations, and a few passages she had read so many times they had become as ordinary to her as breathing. He had left her nothing that could be spent. He had left her everything that could be used, and for 20 years she had not known how far that distinction would have to carry her. She moved onto the South Fork parcel in the first week of April, when the ground was cold enough to walk without sinking past the ankle. She came with her brother's widow, Ada, whose own situation had turned difficult that winter, and with Ada's boy, Cal, who was 9 and not given to complaint, and with a dark-coated working dog she called Bram, who had belonged to her husband and who had been sleeping at the foot of her bed since the funeral with the particular loyalty of an animal that understands more than it is given credit for. She came with the leveling rod and the notebook and a wagon of supplies and no more capital than the price of a season's seed. What she did not come with was a plan to farm the land as anyone in Millhaven expected her to farm it. She walked every foot of it the first 2 days, rod in hand, reading the slope of the ground the way her father had shown her, marking the seams where the water gathered and the slight rises where it did not. Bram went ahead and behind, nose down, cataloging the smell of the place in a language of his own. Ada watched from the edge of the drier ground and said nothing, because she had known Nora long enough to understand that the walking wasn't aimless. On the 3rd day, Nora opened the notebook and read a passage her father had marked with a doubled line. Water asked to move only downhill and only fast enough to carry its load would move cleanly, without washing the walls that held it, without destroying the very channel you had made. The principle was not complicated. The application required patience and the willingness to be wrong about the first 3 attempts and correct on the 4th. She put the notebook in her coat pocket, picked up a spade, and began to dig. The first channel ran 30 yards along the low seam she had marked on the south edge of the property, emptying into a natural depression that connected, below ground, to the creek drainage half a mile east. She cut it in the first week of April, and nothing much happened because the ground was still cold and the water moved slowly. And to anyone watching it looked like a woman digging a ditch for no reason into the worst 40 acres in the county. She cut the second channel along the west margin in the second week, angled 2 degrees north of what the surface slope would suggest, because the notebook's calculation for that type of clay bottom called for a slight correction against the tendency of the soil to compact and close the seam over time. By the 3rd week, the first channel was running, not fast, not dramatically, but running, a clear thread of cold water moving south, where before there had been a standing lens of black water and cattail reed. By May, she had 4 channels operating, and the south quarter of the property had lost 6 inches of standing depth. She was out in it from first light to failing light, cutting and tamping and fitting the split-log sluice gates she had built through the winter from timber she had taken from a fallen stand of ash on the property's north edge. The gates were the piece that confused people most. They were set not across the channels but at angles to them, hinged on a single post so they could be moved, designed to slow the flow at the junctions where two channels met, holding back the kind of sudden surge that in a hard rain could blow out the walls she had packed from the spoil of the digging. Holt Drucker, driving past on the road above the property one afternoon in May, looked down and saw the channels and the odd angled gates, and said to the man beside him that Nora Vane had lost her mind in the grief and was digging herself holes like a widow making graves. The name traveled before she heard it. By June of 1887, in the feed store and on the church steps and at the mill, the South Fork parcel was being called Vane's Folly Hole, and most of Millhaven thought this was about right. She heard the name for the first time from Ada, who had heard it from the miller's wife, who had heard it from Holt directly. Ada told her on a Tuesday evening while they were eating supper and Cal was already asleep, and she said it in a tone that was careful and fair, neither commiserating nor endorsing. Nora thought about it for a moment and then asked Ada if the second channel along the east margin had settled overnight the way she had hoped. Ada said she believed it had. They finished supper. The name did not appear to trouble Nora in any way Ada could measure, which was itself a thing worth noting, because Ada had watched other people receive that kind of news, and most of them either went red or went quiet, in a way that was not ordinary quiet. Nora was simply calculating something, the way a person calculates the cost of materials against a budget, arriving at a figure and moving on. Through the summer, she continued cutting channels. 7 by August, 8 by September, when the autumn rains started, and the water she had been waiting for came down in earnest and ran through her system in exactly the pattern the notebook's figures had described, fast enough to carry its load, slow enough at the junctions to spare the walls. She walked the channels in the rain with Bram at her heels, watching the gates swing and settle, and finding the two places where the angle wanted correction, which she made before the ground froze. Cal came out with her some mornings and learned to read the water's speed by the way it moved over a stick laid flat across the channel, and she explained to him in plain language what his great-uncle Elias had explained to her, that the principle was not complicated, that the work was only in the reading, and that the reading required more patience than most people believed they owned. 9 channels by November. And then winter, and the hardest part of the work, which was building upward rather than digging down. She had chosen the site for the platform in July, on the slight rise in the center of the now draining parcel, a place where the ground had always been 2 feet drier than the surrounding low. She and Ada and Cal spent 3 weeks in late autumn cutting and filling, raising a rectangular earthen platform 4 feet above the old flood grade, faced on its vertical sides with the flat stone she had hauled from the creek bed, fitted tightly without mortar because she had read in the notebook that mortared joints in earthen walls cracked under freeze and heave, and the crack let water in, while tight-fitted stone moved with the ground and stayed sound. It was slow work, the kind of work that is measured in inches over weeks, rather than in visible progress from one morning to the next. And on some evenings, Nora would stand at the edge of what had been built and look at what remained and feel the gap between them the way a person feels the distance between a borrowed dollar and a debt. But she understood, from the notebook and from the channels already running, that the work was not of the kind that rewarded impatience. The platform grew by a course of stone every other day in the cold weeks, and by a course a day in the dry weeks of early November, when the ground was firm underfoot, and the light lasted long enough to fit stone by eye. Cal hauled spoil in a barrow, and learned to read the face of the stone for its flat edge, which Nora had taught him to find by running a hand across the surface in a particular way, feeling for the grain. Ada kept the mortar from the food warm and the fire from going out, and the supply of dry wood from running short, which was a full day's work in itself, and one she carried without comment. On the platform, she built the house, a low, tight structure with thick log walls packed with the clay she had dried from the channel's spoil. The roof pitched at the angle her father had described as the one that sheet ice rather than holding it, the angle that let a heavy snow slide before its weight could work the roof joints apart. She hung the door so it swung inward and latched with a bar rather than a latch, because a bar could be held from the inside against a surge that put pressure on the face of the door, and Elias had noted in the margin of one calculation that in a serious flood, an outward swinging door was a liability, not a convenience. These were not the choices a person made who expected to succeed once and move on. They were the choices of a person who expected to be tested and who wanted to be ready when the testing came. Holt Drucker saw the platform going up from the road in late October and drove his rig down the property lane and sat at the edge of the raised ground for several minutes without speaking. Nora did not stop working. Finally, he said that she was building on a raised mud pile in the middle of a swamp, and that come spring there would be nothing left of it. She said, without looking up from the stone she was fitting, that the platform was 4 feet above the highest watermark recorded in the South Fork lowland in the 30 years her father had kept notes on the property. Holt said that was Vane's Folly Hole and its Folly platform, and that he supposed she knew her own business best, and drove back out. Ada, who had been watching from the platform above, said nothing until the sound of his rig had faded. Then she said she thought the front wall was coming straight. Nora said she thought so too. By the spring of 1888, the channels were performing the way the notebook's figures had promised they would, moving freely, carrying the winter's snowmelt south and east and out of the parcel in a steady, unhurried flow that left the surface drier than any 40 acres of bottomland in the county had a right to be in March. The gossip in Millhaven shifted from outright dismissal to a kind of watchful puzzlement, which Nora preferred because puzzlement at least contained the possibility of being revised. People who had not been to the South Fork piece in months drove past it and slowed and looked and did not say much about what they saw, which was a drained field and a raised stone platform and 9 channels running in the long light of a mild spring morning, and which was either the strangest thing in the county or the most competent thing in the county, and nobody had quite decided which. At the church social in May of 1888, Holt stood with 3 other men near the side door and said to them, in the particular tone of a man confirming something he had long believed, that Vane's Folly Hole had dried out some on top, but that the bottom was still black water and always would be, and that any woman who built a stone-faced mud platform in a swamp was welcome to sleep on it when the river decided to say otherwise. This is a story about what the river decided. If you have found yourself in a place that others have decided has no value, stay with it to the end. Old Gus Farr, standing near enough to hear, said he had walked the South Fork piece 2 weeks prior and found it changed in ways he would not have predicted. Holt thanked Gus for his report and said he supposed changed and safe were 2 different things, and that the river would have the final word, as it always did. And then he looked across the room at Nora, who was helping Ada carry plates to the long table, and she felt the look and did not return it, because she was thinking about the 9th Channel's East Junction, and whether the gate angle she had reset in November was holding correctly, and because there was nothing in his look that required an answer from her. By the summer of 1888, she had 22 acres of the parcel producing a working crop, the first real crop the South Fork lowland had ever carried in anyone's memory. She had 4 acres of kitchen garden running off the platform's north edge. She had Bram and Ada and Cal and the notebook and the leveling rod and 9 channels and a stone-face platform. And she was by any measure she knew how to apply, not failing quietly at all. The Scioto began its rise in the second week of March, 1889. Nora felt it first, not in the water but in the ground, a soft change in the way the south channels ran, a slight backing up at the lowest junction that told her something upstream had shifted. She noted the date in the margin of her father's notebook, March the 11th, 1889, East Junction slowing. She set the sluice gates to their widest position and packed the platform stone-facing with additional clay along the east side, where the first surge would arrive if the river broke its banks below the mill. She sent Ada and Cal into town on the 12th to collect what stores they could carry back and told Ada to note what she saw at the river gauge on the bridge. Ada came back that evening and said the gauge read 14 feet above summer low, and that Holt Drucker at the feed store had told 2 customers that a little high water was nothing the county had not managed before, and that there was no call for alarm. The Pinter boy, Dan, who worked at the mill, had told Ada in passing that the water upstream was coffee-colored, which meant it was carrying clay and not just snowmelt, and that the sluicemen at the mill had extended the overflow boards to their full height that afternoon for the first time in 4 years. Nora heard that part of Ada's report and put 4 extra cords of wood in the shed on the platform's north end before dark. By the morning of the 14th, the river stood at 19 feet above summer low. By the morning of the 15th, it stood at 21, and a neighbor named Rudd, who farmed the flat ground a half-mile north, came by to ask if there was cause for concern, and Nora said she thought there was, and that she would be glad to take in whoever needed a place if the low ground went. Rudd said he appreciated the thought and drove back home and spent the day moving his stock to his cousin's barn on the Ridge Road, which was a decision that would save the animals and his own life. By evening of the 15th, the river crested at 22 feet, a height the Mill Haven settlement had not seen in 30 years, and the bottomland farms began to flood before midnight. The Callaway lowfields went first, 2 miles north, the water coming across the road in an hour and carrying fence posts ahead of it. And the 2 Callaway men who tried to drive their stock to high ground found the road already gone and lost all 11 head of cattle, and barely came through themselves, reaching the Ridge Road on foot in the dark with nothing. The Pinter farm, a quarter-mile east of Nora's parcel, flooded to the windowsills by 2 in the morning, the family up in the loft with their winter stores, 200 pounds of dried corn and a winter's worth of smoked meat, already ruined on the floor below. The Heck place, which sat a foot lower than the Pinter, flooded to the roof line before dawn, the family escaping to a neighbor's hay barn on higher ground with the clothes they were wearing and a single lamp. The Rudd family lost their barn entire and all the animals in it, which would have been Rudd and his animals, both had he not listened. The Moss family lost their root cellar and the winter stores they had been eating against since November. By first light on the 16th, 23 farms in the South Fork bottomland had water in them from the floor to somewhere above the knees, and 6 families had lost all their winter livestock, and 2 men from the Callaway operation had not been accounted for as of the morning count at the mill, and their names would be in the county record by the following week. The road into Mill Haven was under 2 feet of cold brown water that moved with a deliberate, patient weight, the kind of weight that does not argue and does not hurry and does not stop. Nora's platform stood at 4 feet of clear air above the flood. She had known since the previous evening that it would. She had read the gauge number Ada brought back and done the calculation from the notebook's elevation figures, and the figure she had arrived at was 2 feet of clearance on the low side of the platform and 4.5 on the high side, and she had put the notebook away and gone to bed. because there was nothing left to do and because sleep was a form of preparation, the same as any other. In the morning, she stood at the platform's edge with Bram beside her, his coat dark and wet from the rain, but his posture easy, untroubled, the posture of a dog that takes its cue from the person standing next to it. And she watched the water settle around the stone, facing at exactly the height she had predicted. And she watched the channels work, moving the surge through the exit points at the south and east, slowing at the junctions where the angled gates held the debris back. Log and limb and fence board turning in the slow backwash behind each gate while the water ran clean below it. The channels did not collapse. The gates held. The platform did not shift. Ada stood in the doorway of the house with Cal's hand in hers and watched the water reach its line and stop. And the three of them understood together, without anyone saying it, that the work was done and it had held. Before noon on the 16th, the Pinter family arrived at the edge of Nora's property in a wagon with the water pulling at the wheels, and she called them up. The Heck family arrived an hour later, 5 of them, the children wrapped in everything they owned, the mother carrying a lamp with no oil left in it. By evening, she had 11 people on the platform and 4 animals in the shed she had built on the platform's north end, all of them dry, all of them fed from the store she had laid in, while the water sat at its quiet, indifferent line, 2 feet below the lowest stone of her facing. They burned a quarter cord of her firewood in 3 days. The interior temperature of the house did not fall below 54 degrees. Outside, the rain came in short, cold bursts, and the water held its level, and did not discuss the matter further. On the morning of the 3rd day, the 18th of March, Holt Drucker arrived at the edge of the property in a borrowed flatboat, standing in the bow with a pole in his hands, and his coat dark with water to the waist. He had come from the direction of the mill road, 3 miles of open bottomland where nothing else was standing above the water. He brought the flatboat to the base of the platform's east facing, and stood there for a moment, looking up at the stone and the people moving behind the windows, and at the channels running clean on either side of the platform, and at Bram watching him from the top of the stone staircase Nora had built against the east, facing the previous autumn. And then he looked at Nora, who was standing at the top with the leveling rod in her hand, and he said nothing for a time that was long enough to be its own kind of statement. Then he said it, quietly, without theater, in the voice of a man who had just traveled 2 miles through cold water and arrived at a conclusion he was not going to pretend he had reached before now. He said, "You knew how high it would come." Nora said that her father had taught her to read the ground. She reached down and offered him her hand and helped him up. Within a year of the flood, Fen Marsh, the county surveyor who had come to the South Fork lowland in April of 1889 to document the damage and found Nora's parcel standing in the middle of it like a word in a language the county had not known it was missing, had filed a survey report that described her channel system in careful detail, including the angle of the sluice gates and the elevation of the platform, and the observation that the channels had moved the March surge without failing because they had been cut to match the slope of the underlying clay rather than the surface grade, a distinction that accounted for the difference between a drainage system that worked and one that merely looked like a drainage system. He sent a copy of the report to the State Agricultural Board in Columbus. The board sent back a letter of acknowledgement and a request for further particulars. Nora answered the particulars from the notebook, citing Elias's figures directly, and Fen Marsh drafted the final report in the summer of 1890 using her answers, attributing the method to Elias Vane and his Dutch father, Peter, and naming the channel and gate configuration in plain descriptive language rather than a tradesman's term, because Nora had asked him not to name it after her. Within 2 years, 3 farms in the Scioto bottomland had hired men to cut channels on the same principle. guided by copies of Fenn's report. Within 5 years, the South Fork lowland had a different name in the county's informal geography. Not the Blackwater piece anymore, but the Vane ground, spoken without contempt and without particular praise either, which was the kind of rename that meant the conversation had moved on from whether the thing worked and arrived at how. Holt Drucker, in the spring of 1891, hired Nora to consult on the drainage of a low corner of his own feed store property that had been troublesome in wet years, and he paid her the going rate for a surveyor's day, which she accepted without comment. They were not friends. They were, by 1891, people who understood each other's measure accurately, which in a small county in a river bottomland is its own kind of peace, arrived at slowly and without ceremony, the way most peace in such places arrives. By the first years of the new century, the parcel she had been given as a disposal showed 31 acres in productive tillage, the channels running clean, the platform house standing on its stone-faced base as solidly as the day she had packed the last stone into the east facing. Cal was grown and farming his own ground by then, using the notebook's principles on a low parcel of his own, east of the Mill Road, and his channels were good because he had learned not from watching Fenn Marsh's report, but from walking every foot of the South Fork piece with Nora through 3 seasons of work and learning to feel the ground's intention before he touched it. Ada lived in town by the middle of the decade. Her own circumstances improved, but she came back to the South Fork on the first cool day of every autumn, the way certain people return to the place where they first understood something important about themselves. And she and Nora would walk the channels together and note what the season had done to them and what wanted attention. Bram died in the winter of 1904, in the house on the platform, beside the hearth he had slept near for 17 years, and Nora buried him at the base of the east facing, in the ground that had been standing black water on the day they arrived together, the ground she had read and cut and shaped into something that had stood when everything around it failed. She did not speak about it to Ada or to Cal or to anyone else. She planted a small flat stone at the head of the grave and continued her work, because the work was the best way she knew to carry forward what she meant, and because the ground in the springtime required attention regardless of grief. In the 1920s, when the state of Ohio began its systematic drainage survey of the Scioto bottomlands, the engineers who came through Millhaven stopped at the South Fork piece and measured Nora's channels, by then more than 30 years old and still running, and found that the angle of the sluice gates matched within 2 degrees, the figure the state's own hydraulic engineers had arrived at independently through calculation in the 1910s as the ideal angle for debris deflection in a clay bottom cut of that width. The lead engineer, a young man named Dowell who had come from the technical school in Columbus, asked Nora how the angle had been determined. She took the notebook from the shelf and showed him the page. Peter Vane's handwriting in Dutch with Elias's translation in the margin in English, dated 1848. Dowell looked at the page for a long time. He said he would like to include it in the survey record if she was willing. She said she was willing, as long as it was attributed to the men who had worked it out, which were her grandfather and her father, neither of whom had held a certificate or attended a technical school, or ever expected anyone outside a river bottomland to care what they knew. Dowell said he understood, and he copied the passage into his survey notes in careful block letters, and those notes went to Columbus, and from Columbus in the cleaned-up form of a state drainage bulletin, out across the agricultural counties of the state. The South Fork parcel stood and produced for decades after Nora was gone. The channels maintained first by Cal, and then by his daughter, Rue, who had learned from Cal the way Cal had learned from Nora, which is to say by walking the ground with the leveling rod until the ground's intention became readable, and who maintained the sluice gates with the same untheatrical exactness, because she understood as Cal had understood. that the method was not about the specific angle or the specific depth, but about the habit of reading before cutting, of following the water's own line rather than imposing a line upon it. The platform house stood on its stone-faced base through the wet springs of 1913 and 1927 and 1937, when the river ran high enough each time to confirm what the March of 1889 had first established. The channels never failed in a flood, because they had never been built to resist the water, only to move it, which is the difference between a wall and a road, and the difference between knowledge that breaks under pressure and knowledge that flows. On clear mornings in summer, when the light came early across the bottomland and the channels ran with a bright thread of water, moving south through the green of the tillage, the South Fork piece looked from the road above like something that had always been there, a piece of ground that had always been read correctly, which is what all good work looks like once it has been done long enough. The stone at the base of the east facing was still there in those years, half covered by the grass, catching the morning light at an angle that made it visible if you knew to look. Most people did not know to look. The ones who did had been taught to, and the teaching had come from a notebook, and the notebook had come from a pair of hands that understood, long before the county did, that what the low ground needed was not to be refused, but to be understood. The water still moves through those channels,